it identifies a few different value streams associated with microgrids. One is demand response. That is, Joel did a good job of sort of setting up the energy system. A lot of people think it's just sort of this homogeneous thing that percolates along. But in fact, the value of power, you can think of the energy system as sort of pulsating through the days. Through the day, at various times, the value of energy or the cost of using energy is actually very high for the system as a whole. But you don't necessarily face that because the utility just charges you at the average cost. So the consequences of you doing your laundry at 5 p.m. on the hottest day of the year are actually very high. But they're not that high to you. They're just high to everybody else. You share the cost with everybody else in the process. Joel also talked about time of day pricing. That's an important thing, but it's really a waypoint on the way to real-time pricing. Time of day sort of averages what power might be worth at noon, what it might be worth at 1 o'clock, what it might be worth at 2 o'clock, and it charges you according to that. But the real way to do it, and the system is sort of gradually migrating towards that, is to charge people for the true value at an instant in time for what they're doing. And that's a step beyond time of day pricing. So there's some value if your microgrid can respond to the demand. That is, if you can curtail use or dispatch some of your battery storage or something like that. There's a real value to that if you could time that to when the system really had high real-time prices. Okay, so that's in some future universe where we get real-time pricing figured out. More in today's universe, what a microgrid, the main value stream is generation for own consumption, that is avoiding having to pay the retail rate for power, and any export, that is whatever the grid will pay you for power that you send the other direction. So those are the main things I'm going to talk about. Those and the obstacles to getting a reasonable price for this. There's some value in outage resistance. This is really more engineering things, local energy markets. I think I'll just move on. So the general question with power, like with a lot of things, is it better to just buy it from the grid or to make it yourself? First question, is it even possible if you're not a utility to make your own power and sell it to others? And the answer is technologically yes. Wasn't always so, but technologically the answer is yes. Legally, economically, and practically, the answer is yes, but. Long pause. That's a qualified yes. Okay, so legally, a couple of things. The sort of reigning legislation started in the 70s, PURPA, the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act. For the first time, the grid became read-write. That is, the load-serving entities had to accept power as well as dish it out. Right? That's a new thing. And they were only required to pay qualified facilities, which were renewable energy technologies, and they were required to pay them their avoided cost. Right? So if you put solar cells on the White House and they're producing a little more than the White House is using, Jimmy Carter wants to sell it back to the utility, what can he get? The utility is supposed to figure out, well, what cost did I not incur because I'm using his power instead of having to generate my own? The power's just going to the next door neighbor anyway. So what costs were avoided? Well, I wish that were an easy calculation. It's not. Other legislation, the Energy Policy Act of 1991 really brought competition to the wholesale market. So we used to be in this perfect world of regulated monopoly where the utility had an exclusive geographic footprint. Nobody else could compete there, and the utility planned generation, and it planned transmission, and it planned distribution, and it planned marketing, and the whole works, in exchange for which they were regulated by the Public Utility Commission. That's not true anymore. Competition has come to the wholesale power market. Anybody can sell. Independent energy producers can sell into the wholesale market now. It's a big, complex, competitive bidding process. Okay, practically, a couple of things you might want to know if you want to do this, if you want to start your own microgrid, is that when you go to the North Pole, it's very discouraging when you discover somebody else's flag is already planted there, right? There are already people in this space, or there are already institutions in this space, and they have a lot to say about what you can do and what you can't do. The load-serving entities basically take it on two flavors. They are regulated monopolies, which are investor-owned and for-profit, like Excel or Otter Power, and co-ops or municipal utilities, which are owned by their customers. Okay, and the incentives don't always line up in such a way that they're just the load-serving entity will just step aside and let you do whatever it is you want. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Here's a schematic of the way power works traditionally. Up at the top left, you have a generation station, that's a big coal plant, or a thermal plant someplace. Voltage is stepped up and sent over high transmission wires. Voltage is stepped down and sent over 115 kV transmission lines and stepped down again, and eventually down to the local substation where it's distributed at 12.5 kilovolts until it gets to that little biscuit on your telephone pole behind your house, which steps it down to what, 220, 110, 220. Okay, so that's the way the system traditionally has worked. What a microgrid does is it displaces power produced elsewhere. And on that graphic I just had up, the power is produced way over there. It's way up there, and it has to travel a long way before it gets to residential sites. Okay, so what's that worth? I'm getting back to the question of avoided costs again. What's it worth, and will it get compensated for the full value of the energy it produces, right? So if you want microgrids to happen, they have to realize the value streams that I was talking about at the beginning. That is avoided retail costs and what they can sell back to the grid. The true avoided cost calculation is a non-trivial managerial accounting problem, and it's not necessarily in the utility or the rural electric cost interest to be totally transparent about that, honestly. They have their own interests, they have their own assets that are in competition. And it's a function of how the regulatory compact is working, how they recover their investment. But I mean, fundamentally, an investor-owned utility, the CEO of an investor-owned utility is responsible to his shareholders rather than customers, right? And there can be a difference there. Okay, so avoided costs. If we had a Morris microgrid that produced a megawatt of power on site, Otter Tail Power could turn something down somewhere else in the system, right? They could probably turn it down a little bit more than one megawatt because there's some line loss between there and here. So they'd save whatever the costs were in generation in North Dakota. They'd burn less coal, there'd be lower operational costs, less wear and tear, depreciation of the plant, less congestion of the transmission network, delayed need for transmission upgrades, if you think of this in a dynamic sense over time, etc. Those are the kinds of things you'd have to figure out if you want to come at a true avoided cost calculation. Okay, so what do they actually say? This is Otter Tail Power. If you look over on the right-hand side, they claim that 41% of their costs have to do with generation, 20% have to do with transmission, and the rest has to do with distribution. So about 61% G&T. This is the Red Lake Electric Co-op in northern Minnesota. And if you look at the second pie chart there, it says power purchased is about 76.27%. They don't have transmission and generation, they just buy. But it's delivered to their substation, it's about 76% of their cost structure. Over on the right, you have Minnesota Power. Their costs are reported for different categories of customers: residential, commercial, industrial, and lighting. And it varies between 63 and 99%, I think, what their generation and transmission costs are. Okay, so roughly, if we average all this together, we'd say roughly 2/3 of the costs the utilities are telling their customers are coming from generation and transmission. Okay, so here's another model. And this is a guy who's actually working on local and locally based systems. A man named Dan Jewell, the name should be familiar to a lot of you. He's really the first guy in Minnesota to figure out how do you do local ownership? How do you do so much of the value streams were tied up in investment tax credits, for which you had to have a really big tax appetite in order to capture them, right? So Dan was the first guy who figured out how to partner a group of local farmers with a big, John Deere finance or something, and make a deal where it's called the Minnesota Flip model. But it became sort of a model for developing wind power in a way that ownership reverted to local people, some local ownership and control of the generation asset. Well, so Dan's moved on to other things, and he's got this sort of massive vision right now. It's kind of fun to think about, but he sort of pictures a little 5 megawatt system outside every little small town from St. Cloud out to Billings, Montana, or something like that, right? So just outside your substation, a little setup that is a combination of wind and solar. And he's got some neat sort of wrinkles that make it possible for all the power to flow through one inverter. They can share an inverter. So I have no financial relationship with Dan Jewell, by the way. I'm kind of interested in the work that he does. So his idea is to locate these things right by the local substation, serve the local load, and then turn over the keys, once he's got his money on it, turn over the keys to the local city manager, right? And so the question is, what is the true avoided cost? And he's been running into all kinds of trouble. There's a complicated dispute in front of the Public Utility Commission about how much they should really be paying him for avoided cost. He's got a proposal up at Red Lake Falls right now. And according to the data I was just showing you, utilities and RECs are reporting about 60 to 70% of their costs have to do with generation and transmission. Well, a model located on the outskirts of town is not relying on that, right? It's strictly displacing distribution, right? So 60 to 70% of Otter Tail's costs would be somewhere between 6 and 9 cents a kilowatt hour, something like that. But they're offering 2.9. Why? Where does that number come from? They're telling the Public Utility Commission that they can do wind out in western North Dakota for 2.9 cents, right? And so that's the true avoided cost. And in a sense it is, except that's just the cost of generation, right? After it's generated, you have to reinforce the wires to get it to the high tension transmission lines, and then you have to upgrade transmission across the state and all this other stuff. The thing is that all of that is not, all the infrastructure investment between the wind farm and the local Minnesota substation would be capital. And this is the way, we have to come to terms with the fact that this is the way that utilities make their money. They're not bad people. This is what they do. This is the way the regulatory compact is structured. They make their money when they commission new capital projects, right? And so to them, if they can put it out in North Dakota and put all the transmission upgrades into the rate base, that's good for their shareholders, good for the company, right? It's a feature of rate of return regulation and volumetric pricing that makes distributed generation a threat rather than an opportunity from the point of view of the utility. Okay, so the case for local, moving on, basically is import substitution. If we make it here, then we don't have to import it, so we're not sending our money elsewhere. That case is a lot more persuasive when local doesn't mean more expensive. I've tried to argue that it's not. In the Dan Jewell case, some research I did years ago on local ownership versus non-local ownership. This was for wind turbines. I think the numbers came out that, so first of all, the multipliers are really small. In small towns, the money leaves in a hurry, right? If you have an injection of money you know, most of your money you don't spend locally. And what you do spend locally, if you buy dinner over there, most of that goes to input costs, and they spend out of town anyway. So the multipliers are very strong, but very small. But the initial impact can be very large. I found that local ownership was. So what have I got here? Employment impacts were between, I think, 2 and 5 times greater if it was locally owned, and value added was, I forget what the exact ratios are, but the right-hand columns are the non-local ownership, and the left-hand columns are the optimistic scenario for local ownership. So back to Dan Jewell's project, he can put one of these in the ground for a levelized cost of energy of 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Otter tail avoided cost, according to their billing statement, should be something like 7.25 cents. Okay, if the local government got 7.25 cents as the avoided cost, then the little 5 megawatt project yields about $400,000 a year to Red Lake Falls, which is a tiny little community. So I see Blaine's here. Could you use an extra $400,000 from a Morris microgrid? I think that would get your attention anyway. But the point is that if that is the true avoided cost, it makes nobody else worse off elsewhere. We're not just shifting costs onto the next door neighbor, right? There's a lot of finger pointing in this arena where people think if you put up some renewable energy, you're just making everybody else pay the costs. If it's the true avoided cost, you're not. Nobody else is worse off. If, I guess, except possibly somebody who owns shares in a utility that could have gotten some higher dividends. Okay, utility 2.0. Okay, so this has been really hard, and it's been kind of rough, and I haven't had any nice pictures. So to reward you, there's some pictures of some otters. Nobody can feel sad when you're looking at a picture of an otter. And I was a little mean to Otter Tail Power, so this is kind of doing penance for that too. But if you have any questions later, I'll be happy to talk.